I love all the people that cover the podcast beat, but when it comes to being an investigative reporter who breaks stories, Ashley is the only game in town. If somebody has to start by following one journalist in this field, it is Ashley Carman, period.
Welcome to the Media Roundtable, Industry Edition. If you've been keeping up with us, we've spent the last few years talking to leading voices in podcast about what they create, why they create it, and the impact they want it to have on the world. This is a true roundtable format, and like we say in the name, this is our Industry Edition. So it's going to be less focused on creators and more about how media and audio industry experts can adapt to the news of the day. Today, I'm your host, Jennifer Laine, Head of Marketing and Special Projects at Oxford Road. I'm joined by Dan Granger, founder and CEO of Oxford Road, Neal Lucey, EVP Strategy and Product at Oxford Road, and Ashley Carman, journalist at Bloomberg. Welcome to the show, guys. Ashley, thank you so much for joining. We're pleased to have you. At the start of the year, you wrote an article in Bloomberg called The Great Podcasting Market Correction. So for those who haven't read the article, do you want to give a brief, very brief top line on sort of your take on how the market is sort of coming back to podcast and what that means for 2023?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. So the piece that I published with my colleague, Lucas Shaw, we talk about how, the past few years in podcasting, as everyone is well aware, has been one of a lot of hype, a lot of companies entering the space, multi-million-dollar deals, licensing deals, like acquisitions, all these things. And that this year we have seen really kind of a pullback on spending from quite a few of those large companies. So we point that out. We talk a little bit about how MGs are changing or ad shares changing, like rev share. And we just talk a little bit about like the vibe in podcasting right now and some specific examples where maybe in the past we would have seen some deals pull through and how that didn't really happen in these past few months.
So a shift in, I think the key points that I took out of the article were one, sort of a hiring freeze or people being let go from podcast companies, as you mentioned, lower acquisition amounts or fewer acquisitions, slower growth rates. I wonder though, compared to other channels, it seems like the growth rates are staying stronger than that of like CTV or social. Is that something that you're seeing? Or is this something where you think they're all pulling back in a more even way?
You mean growth in like listeners or?
Growth in listeners and in ad revenue.
Yeah, so that's one of the really bright spots that we're seeing is that there has been evidence that there's growth in listeners and in ad revenue, although Edison, I did think, saw a little bit of a drop last year. Anyway, so there was some evidence last year that Edison said there was a drop in listeners, but for the broad part, we can probably assume like listeners is likely growing. And ad revenue, we talked to Magellan AI for this piece. They shared some examples of areas where revenue has actually grown in the podcast space. So it's not so much a question of like, is this not growing as, hey, there were these really big deals that happened. You would expect that maybe to continue or have some really big blockbuster headlines to come out of it. And we're seeing that actually these same companies that have spent a ton of money in the space are actually pulling back. So that was kind of more what we focused on, but we totally mentioned the growth as well.
And one more question for me, and then I'm going to pass it to Dan and Neal for a few questions. Do you think that's just generally in line with heading into a recession, or do you think there is a circumstance sort of beyond the recession that is causing a slowdown?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of what we're seeing here is just evidence of the fact that podcasting's fate is really tied to tech companies. So whether or not there's a recession, I think we've seen an even bigger correction in tech world, which is tons of layoffs at Meta and Amazon as just two top line examples, but of course, tons of startups as well and other companies. So it just sort of demonstrates how what happens at those tech companies, they're heavily invested in the podcast space as well. And so what happens to them, the fates are tied, essentially.
Yeah, reading an article in The Information this morning, it said that on average, 1,600 tech employees have been laid off every single day since the start of 2023. So it's happening across the board for sure. Neal, you had a question. Do you want to dive in?
Part question, part observation. I think I'll start with the observation. When I saw that you wrote about the kind of the ad spend declining, or maybe not in fully declining, it kind of raised my attention because a lot of the industry estimates out there are for continued ad growth. But what I thought was interesting, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, was the ad spend has grown, but the number of podcasts have really exploded over the past few years. I think I read 2019 there was something like 800,000 podcasts. In 2022 there's over 4 million. So even though the ad spend has grown from like 700 million to 1.7 billion, like the amount per podcast has actually declined. So is that part of what you're like citing when the spending has kind of been reduced from that perspective? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's many more shows competing for, a more of there's a larger pie, but there's a lot more people that want a piece of it. And so, of course, that's going to factor in. And I think this really didn't come up in the piece, but one thing that I think we saw was, I think it was a year ago, I wrote about how ad deals, like rev share deals, were kind of the future of the space. All these companies wanted inventory to fill, to really bulk up their inventory so they could sell more ads. And I think what we're seeing now is if ad spend slows down, well, they have all these commitments to this inventory, and if they're not able to fill it, then what happens there? So yes, I think that just there's a lot of shows, a lot of guarantees were made. It's going to be difficult, maybe if there's a slowdown in advertising, to commit and follow through on them all.
So I want to jump in here because I think from where I sit, the challenge that we have in podcast is not at all about, is it a durable channel? Is the channel as valuable as what it's earning today in top line revenue? I think it's a great channel that's going to continue to grow. But the biggest problem is it's all about expectations. And I think right now what we're starting to experience is a little bit of being a victim of our own hype. Like people talk about Trump as, I'm just going to use this as a marketing metaphor, how much free advertising he got in the primaries, how much real estate was given to him by every news channel, and what is the value of that earned media that he received, and how much did that make him inevitable? And when you think about podcast in those terms, like podcast has been, how many SNL sketches have talked about podcast for an industry that is nothing across the ecosystem? How much inventory does SNL give to other forms of emerging media or streaming audio, like which is doing multiple times the amount of revenue as the podcast ecosystem? And yet it's all the rage. It's all anybody talks about. How many politicians do we have doing podcasts? And when you had thousands of podcasts and then Adam Carolla comes in and it's like, wow, there's a comedian that I've heard of who's actually doing this. Then you're the 3,000th comedian to do a new show. You're the 800th A or B list celebrity to do a chat show. The thing gets diluted, and the price tags that the networks were paying and the money that was flowing into some of these M&A deals made it almost impossible to keep up with the hype that was being generated because it was just so popular. So I feel like, we're moving into a moment of clarity in the marketplace across all industries, and we're stopping and we're going like, all right, we suspended some of the normal logic for the last few years. There's been a lot of exuberance, and now we have to square that with reality. But there's only so much revenue to go around, and people are now saddled with the debts they've taken on by making these contractual commitments to try to win in this competitive market. It's like what we had to deal with the Great Resignation and the cost of talent going up, and everybody's in a bidding war. Podcast had that times like 1,000, except now it's their ability to realize returns on that is diminishing very quickly. So that's how I see it. So I'm going to pivot this into a question for you, Ashley. Is as you think about, like, have you spent time looking at our cousins in YouTube influencer marketing? as an ecosystem to try to see parallels or differences. Because when we've been involved on the buying side for, I don't know, 8 or 9 years on that, and we've watched that industry go through shifts. And I feel like they became, when we got into the business, it was just like podcasts. And then very quickly we saw representation spring up really quick. Big brands started doing really big deals. Studios started getting involved. There's Maker Studios, $500 million bought by Disney. Now, all of a sudden, Disney is in the YouTube influencer game until they're not a year later, because they all exploded, because they were victims of their own hype. Are we on that track? Are we going to see an implosion of the institutional money that came into the space, and then kind of a refragmentation of the ecosystem? Do you think that's there's any shot at that being the trajectory here?
I mean, I think part of what drove, YouTube's story was just the fact that they're so good at monetization of, any video, especially the creators you're probably thinking of. And of course, there were multiple adpocalypses where it was like Coca-Cola finds out that their ads next to something that they really didn't expect it to be next to. And currently, I think in podcasting, and this is like we hit on in the piece, is a lot of that hype was built around this idea of, can we build programmatic marketplaces where, the machine runs itself. We can get these advertisers in, everyone can monetize, and it's like this beautiful vision. It hasn't fully panned out like that yet. It's a lot of, hands-on selling and buying. And so there's less surprises. And I think that storyline is really critical here to YouTube's story, and whether we'll see something similar in podcasting. Like, I think programmatic advertising is kind of the big conversation there.
Yeah, well, and with the programmatic piece, I mean, YouTube is kind of plugged along with their model, but at least they got to control the whole ecosystem of, that universe. But, the challenge with podcasts is nobody owns the real estate, and it's very fragmented. But then most of what's driving it is based on still what's connected to talent. And I don't know how it pencils. Maybe programmatic has to be 5 years ahead of where it is today to keep up with the financial models that justified the acquisitions and the big talent deals. But yeah, it's an interesting season that we're in. And I think that, like, to just kind of underscore some of my response to what I've seen you writing earlier, is that I think the industry is going to be fine. And I think that if you want to sponsor podcasts, that's going to continue to be an option. You want to listen to podcasts, you're going to keep having more good options to listen to than you got time to listen. But if you're somebody that's got investment in some of these things that have been potentially bubbles, this is a great time to be rethinking strategy and maybe being a little more risk averse. And I think what you're citing is that a lot of the deals that we're seeing are looking nothing like they did 18 months ago.
Yeah, definitely. We didn't get into it as much in this piece, but there was a story that I wrote, I think quoted you in it, about direct response advertisers really being the ones who are kind of sticking through this storm and always kind of being the bedrock of podcasting, and how. And I wrote in the piece about how there's been pushes to, not let people buy on individual shows or do embedded ads or baked in, whatever you want to call it. I think you guys call it embedded. Some people call it baked in. I don't know.
Save the live reads.
Yeah. And now, maybe there's some wiggle room on those negotiations. So I've written a piece or two about kind of how that world is changing as well.
Yeah, well, and it is changing. And, I think they've been trying to hurry up. I think the marketplace, in aggregate has been trying to hurry up and turn this thing into radio real quick. And it's like, we need to get spot breaks. We want to have multiple spots in a break, multiple times an hour. Oh, and yeah, the talent's going to be, they keep kind of like tiptoeing backwards out of the room of, what used to be all these endorsements everywhere. And now it's like, yes, we will read your copy, but less interest in talent engaging and getting on calls, getting familiar with the product. It's getting harder to get interest from the people who are going to be reading the copy, even when they will do it, to take the same pride as they used to do. But what I hope that this yields is a splitting off of the world so that they can be served appropriately. You have a spots and dots ecosystem that has always been available in advertising and always will be, and programmatic is going to supplant that so that people can transact at scale with messages they control, full brand safety and suitability in terms of the creative, because it's your message that you pre-produced. And the performance marketers know that never works as well. So you need a certain level of efficiency that our current podcast ecosystem is not ready to bear. That's why we don't see people scaling up their programmatic campaigns. But then on the other side of the house, you have performance marketers. You had it for decades in radio, where the folks that needed to measure the response, they were on the AM dial, and they had hosts. They'd either buy low CPM remnant on spoken word channels, and they'd produce their own ads and buy them cheap. But the real magic was always with the endorsement. That's why the three leading agencies in the podcast ecosystem all came from people who cut their teeth selling radio endorsements, all of us. And because we know that when you have a host saying, let me tell you about something I really believe in, to the tribe that trusts them, the CPM becomes almost irrelevant. All of a sudden, it doesn't matter if it's $40, $50 CPMs. It can still perform at a level that's unprecedented, and the conversion rates are going to be unlike anything you see from an ad channel. But if you're just trafficking ads and building brand awareness and reminding people to do something, you have to buy dirty, rates and low CPMs for that to work. And the sooner the industry embraces that there are two worlds they're living in, the sooner I think we can start to manage expectations better. But unfortunately, I think they've imagined that what would be ideal for the seller will work for the whole ecosystem. And I'm not sure it's going to pencil that way.
On the programmatic side, Ashley, do you think that the sellers expected that programmatic would bring a lot, like explode the amount of investment into podcasts? Because I think one thing that I thought was interesting is basically audio spend in aggregate has really remained unchanged. So it's just kind of shifted. So I look back at 2006 and there was 18 billion in radio, and now there's 18 billion audio. It's just shifted out of radio and gone into podcasts and streaming. So I wonder, the programmatic side of things, which is now dominating podcasts, whether there's this expectation that would bring in like infinitely more ad spend into the market than it really is.
Well, hold on. Before you answer that, I wouldn't say that it's dominating podcasts. I'd say that the dynamic insertion is starting to dominate podcasts. Yes, but programmatic is minimal, but those numbers are unbelievable. Sorry, I just want to clarify that before.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. I was meaning to say dynamic ad insertion kind of taking over the investment and expecting that that would lead to bringing in a lot more dollars than maybe that it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think both programmatic and dynamic, they thought would, and maybe does. But I think with dynamic, obviously the idea is you can monetize the back catalog. That was always what I would always heard from people, is like, oh my gosh, finally we can do this thing. But then the question kind of becomes, all right, how many people are actually listening to the back catalog and are going to hear your advertisement for Mother's Day on Mother's Day? And then I think with programmatic, obviously the idea there is to just access the long tail of podcasting. So some random person in their house making a podcast, sort of like YouTube, they can upload it. Okay, it has 5 listeners. That's fine. We'll put our ads in there, and that's 5 more impressions we can sell against. And so I think that they did. I think that is still probably the value proposition here, is that they can access that long tail eventually. Advertisers will come in and buy on an impression basis, and they will make a lot of money because it's a way to reach a lot of ears all at once.
I guess I hadn't considered that would be one of the driving motivations for podcasts. I mean, the back catalog is like, hey, I finally started looking for money in my couch cushions, but that's couch cushion money. That's not, that's not a side hustle. That's not an extra revenue stream, of any type of scale. But to think about programmatic really just being focused on the long tail. I guess it makes sense in a vacuum till you've had to deal with what people actually say in user generated content and scaling that times, thousands of conversations that you're sponsoring. Like, I guess it's good that we're also in the brand safety and suitability business, because there's no way you can function without automation around that capability. But even still, that feels very, very dangerous. I wonder if they're having to reforecast on those projections.
No clue.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, Neal, when you look at other channels that have gone programmatic, what do you think the arguments are? Do you think it's long tail, or what do you think the other benefits might be?
It's scaling investment. I think the
Right.
other factor, which is sometimes arguable, is that the targeting options, the ability to kind of hone in on specific targets. And, so I think that that's a big allure of programmatic, right? So the efficiency of going after the long tail, especially in digital, is definitely appealing, as well as kind of the advanced targeting options. I think sometimes what we see, however, as performance marketers, you pay a CPM premium for all those targeting layers, and sometimes, oftentimes actually, they undercut the ability to perform because you're paying so much more on a CPM basis that it essentially hurts the return on investment in the back end.
Yeah, I think the promise definitely of targetability is a big motivating factor. The other thing is just the idea of efficiency, whether or not it's achievable, like whether or not the tech can really keep pace with it being more efficient versus actually just having to double check more things now. But the idea that you have less humans touching it, that you can make decisions, have more control. You don't have to call your rep and get them to manually do things. You can just push spots in, pull them out, and, hopefully be buying audiences at whatever scale you choose, rather than having to string together all these programs and do the dirty work of going like, wait, I have to affiliate with 500 of these individuals. Like, it's unbecoming when you're buying at scale. But it's we're not there yet. I think that's part of the big insight, is that this correction, if these companies that made these big investments were baking in the assumption that programmatic would be functional and valuable at scale today, this is a lousy time for a market correction.
In your article, you call out, or you specifically reference Nick Hilton's article about how 2022 was the year podcasting died. And in his article, he has 4 key points. And I know he wrote it, it wasn't your article, but I think they're all very interesting topics to dive into. And so I'm just going to list all 4, and then maybe we start from the top. And I would love to hear your perspective. So the first one was that podcasting is stagnant and unwilling to innovate its way into new demographics. The second is that maybe podcasting will never be a big thing. Maybe it's just a medium thing. The third is the rise of subscription, and is the industry moving in that direction? And then the fourth is one we've spoken about to other guests on previous shows, which is like, what is podcast? What are we calling it? Is podcast the right name? Is it podcast? Is it audio on demand? I think like when it comes to the very first one, do you believe that the industry is innovating in ways that it needs to reach new demographics? Or do you think it's just going too slow, or sort of unwilling to put the key elements of measurement into place in order to keep it sort of a loose and more creative and younger channel?
I mean, I do think people are thinking about it for sure, but I think at the same time, we're talking here about how there's sort of this struggle already happening in what's being produced now, at least from a content perspective. Like, there's a lot of shows being made. We're struggling to monetize, struggling to maybe find a business model that works, or it's a victim of other things going on in the world right now. But regardless, I think that people are trying. It's just a matter of like, can you make money off of that, even if it helps you reach new demographics at the end of the day? That's my take. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that's a really strong take. I guess, Dan, too, I'd be curious to hear your 2 cents on this. I mean, you come from radio, you have such a strong history in radio. A lot of the different sort of innovations in podcasts are coming directly from radio. I guess, like, can you name any innovations that are happening in podcasts that haven't yet happened in radio or may not happen in radio?
Well, listen, I think audio has been reimagined through podcast. I really believe that a renaissance has taken place. Maybe our rate of change from what we used to have is slowing. I think that, it's easy to get caught up in looking at radio natives coming in and dropping radio shows and calling them podcasts. Like, that's been a thing. It's going to be a thing. That's not where to look for the innovation. But when I just look at all the new content coming out, people are constantly trying to hone in on different niche audiences. I think there's been listen, when we came into this, it was just dudes that were geeks or gamers. Like, that was basically it. And I think there's been a huge fanning out of the demographics that the channel is targeting. And I think that the use of the spoken word at different lengths with different types of conversation structures or narrative structures, I think we've got all the innovation that we need. I think that, Nick Quah's story a while ago may be legitimate in that, like, have we seen a breakout like Serial come and revolutionize everything? Maybe not, but you just have to consider there's all these incremental changes happening all the time. What I do think that the industry could do a little better is building a bridge to younger demographics. Audio has always been an older person's medium because it's primarily, it's kids that would listen to it as a jukebox in the car when they weren't playing the music that they wanted on demand, which is, used to be a CD and now it's Spotify, right? Or Pandora, Apple Music, whatever. But I don't think that from a spoken word standpoint, we've been able to really build a bridge to younger folks. I think podcast has averaged younger than radio by about 10 years. But I don't see us really coming in and building a bridge from TikTok to podcast in a way that young people are attracted to. So I think there's opportunity for expansion in that direction. But I also think that we can cherry pick our examples of what's unique content and what's not. And because there's enough of it coming out from all directions, it's easy to get caught up on the stuff that doesn't sound unique or original. But I think the whole industry has reinvented the whole reason I got involved was because talk radio could only cover 3 topics if it wanted to be successful. And they were 3 political topics and they'd have to hit them over and over again. I remember sitting with 2 very successful radio hosts, and they talked about how they became successful in radio. And they said, we used to do a new topic every segment every day, 3 hours a day. And what we figured out was, as we reduced the number of segments and topics we focused on, our audience went up. And with podcast as an industry, it's kind of like it's the fanning out. When the industry started, it was novel that we were working with Dollar Shave Club and somebody could actually mail you razor blades. Like, wow, what an innovation. And then everybody's mailing everything. It's harder to innovate. But what starts to happen is they go, okay, well, in the men's grooming category, now we can actually have 6 different verticals within that. And it's just like it fans out, and then a slice fans out, and then a slice fans out. And I think the half-life on it keeps going. It just isn't as pronounced every time you see an innovation because it may appear more incremental, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess, like, maybe when you're looking at podcasts, this brings us into the second point of, is it a big thing or is it a medium thing? But, like, maybe the way podcast is fanning out right now is to different channels. I mean, it started on Apple, now then went to Spotify. Now, I mean, everyone's doing it, including YouTube, just throwing their hat in. And so we are seeing a lot of momentum still. And maybe it's not necessarily innovation in the way that we think about it generally, but more innovation in the fact that other channels are creating new avenues in order to get into this space. And that in and of itself is innovative. I guess, like, looking at the momentum of so many players getting in 2020 and podcast still being a smaller channel compared to social or CTV, et cetera, like, do we think it's going to be as huge of a thing? I mean, to your point, where we haven't really been able to onboard younger audiences, like the 16 to 24 age group. Like if we can't get them on board, if there isn't a way to create content that's compelling to them where they come back to listen, can it ever be a big thing?
All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. You know, I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, you know, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com.
I guess I wonder if it has to become a big thing. And I mean, it doesn't have to become radio, right? And I think the danger in podcasts right now is it becoming radio. So radio, you know, the reach has gone down, but it's still around 80% of people listen to radio. Podcast listenership is growing, but I don't think it necessarily has to, you know, it doesn't have to be at the scale of radio to be successful. I think that some of, you know, the magic of podcasts is the ability to really reach unique audiences. If you have a passion or interest, you can find plenty of podcasts related to that passion or interest. And so maybe that's the way that it grows its audience continually, is because more and more people find their passions or interests through podcasts. And so that grows listenership rather than trying to become radio or television.
My point of view is similar. I don't think, look, we get carried away with stuff in the marketplace, and in this country, we love to take things to the extreme. And we saw something that was a new platform and ripe for innovation. And we saw things moving up and to the right. And then we said, oh, it has to keep doing that. And in reality, it doesn't have to keep doing that. I think we've got a great business here that could grow 10, 20% a year for many years ahead. And we know that share is going to keep shifting from traditional means to these new distribution vehicles that aren't based on tall towers and big fields. But, you know, I think to Neal's point earlier, it's sobering when you think about a lot of this is really just share shifting over. And I think that there's more share to gain. But I do think that audio is really where things are going, and streaming is, I think if you look at the streaming numbers, it suggests that streaming is always going to be a bigger share of the audio pie than on demand, which is podcast. Both have the ability to innovate. One has an edge when it can play music for free and also carry live news and live sports that are better consumed in real time. That's what's going to keep television going to whatever extent. That's what's going to keep what we call radio going to whatever extent. And the piping will just be through streams instead of through on demand. But the on demand side has shown that it's durable, that it's interesting, and it can continue to scale. So I think if we could have realistic expectations for the channel and not strangle it with the idea that it's got to break 10 billion in the next 4 years, I think things will be fine. But if we're chasing a target that's not based on any type of track record, on-demand audio wasn't that big. How many CDs and records were getting sold of spoken word before there was podcasts? Like, there is a need, there is a share to be gained, but you can't increase people's time that exponentially. The biggest opportunity to kind of tie the last two questions together, that I think, in addition to going after a younger audience, we've talked about this before, and that's the idea for platform innovation. In the form of like dynamic audio. We're getting to a place where things are, the tech is there, it's just not available to us or hasn't been applied in this way. But when can I put in my AirPod and through Chat GPT like AI talk about what I'm interested in at this moment and get recommended to me samples of different long form shows, choose my own adventure, get a summary, go deep, find hosts that are like the host I just heard? When do we get to start engaging with it and having it optimize our experience in the way that we do with all other forms of information? Audio is not on that track yet. I think that could create a really interesting bridge between a universe of smart home technology and the different ways that we're getting information. It's nice to have it on the go. It's nice to be able to do that with your voice. And if we stop distinguishing between like, oh, it has to be a chat show with celebrities, or it has to fit, XYZ format, and you really think of the new opportunities technology is making available, whenever we're going to start harnessing that, then I think you could probably crack open a lot more engagement and show true innovation. But that's going to take a minute.
Sorry, no, I did it. It also takes so much of the effort off of the listener. And I think that would increase the listeners' ability to discover new content. And I think that's what we loved about podcasts initially, was just being able to discover new content, and you were able to tell your friends about it and they didn't know, and you felt like you had a gem. And now there's just, it's really challenging to discover new content in a meaningful way, because one, a lot more people are listening to content, but two, to Ashley, your point earlier, and Neal, there's just such an excess of shows. There's over 2 million shows, and you couldn't possibly scroll through any of them. So if there was a way to make it easily searchable, whether it's AI powered, which makes the most sense, that could be a really interesting innovation for the year ahead. Looking, and to that point, like looking at the year ahead, I guess, like, Ashley, what are you most excited about in regards to like, what stories are you on your edge to see how they play out? I mean, we had so many specific changes in 2023 as it related to like third-party players becoming first-party players in attribution, and I think we're still very in the very early days of understanding that. And that to us, that was one of the biggest stories of 2022. I guess what stories are you most excited to watch in 2023? Where are the question marks that you're just tracking?
Yeah, I think probably the two obvious ones are YouTube. What are they doing? Are they going to do some sort of RSS pipeline, direct integration? What are they doing? Are they spending money? And beyond that, are the people who are taking advantage of YouTube actually seeing any benefit from it? Or are they just investing in that space and not getting any views, and it's not worth their time? So YouTube is an obvious one. And then I also think globally, we've seen quite a bit of investment there. And so the question is, what do those podcast strategies look like abroad, whether it's domestic companies trying to go abroad or companies that are in other countries that are just establishing themselves? And are they going through some of the same issues as the US? How are those markets different? So those are kind of like the two, I would say, like probably most transparent storylines. And then, of course, always looking for some juicy gossip, if anyone ever has it.
Well, Ashley, what do you think is going to happen with the talent deals that have been established? Do you think those are going to come apart, do you think that it's just people are gonna hold their position and be more careful with the upfront commitments that they make? What do you think happens?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a big question for sure. All these agencies really staffed up their podcast agents. So I think the question becomes, if MGs aren't so much of a thing anymore, or they're severely reduced in the amount that they are, then what happens to these agencies? Obviously, I'm not too worried about the big agencies, they're going to be fine. But, what kind of work do they take on? How do they get creative with deals? And for the podcasters who all have agents now, they're giving away 10%. What are they getting for it? I think there's going to be some questions around talent rep and how it really works in the industry and what those deals do actually look like.
As it turned out, oh, sorry, go ahead, Neal.
Yeah, I'm curious on this, talking about YouTube and seeing kind of how that plays out. It's clear, I think, from a consumer perspective, depending on what sources you trust, YouTube is one or two, oftentimes in terms of where consumers go to listen to podcasts. So Spotify, I think, is often one, but I see YouTube up there in the top 1 to 3. So it's clear that consumers have some preference for that as a platform. What do you see from a creator's perspective and how they view YouTube as a platform? Is that something that you look into?
Yeah, I guess I would say first, just to respond to like YouTube being number 2 or whatever, number it is up there, let's say.
Yeah.
One question that I have is that I don't know the answer to is just, it feels like it's a different type of content. Like, yeah, it's called a podcast, but it feels very SEO driven, clips driven, shock value, celebrity. It's a little bit different than I think we typically associate with the podcast space, which tends, to come from radio and like NPR, for example. Like, it feels very different from that type of content. So it does seem like maybe there's going to have to be two worlds. Like, you do your podcast in one way and you do your YouTube channel in a totally different way and totally different spin or angle on the content you're producing. As far as creators go, I mean, again, I think it comes down to just monetization. And what I hear is you can monetize on YouTube. It's really hard to monetize in other places, specifically if you're doing a podcast. So yeah, that's what I hear from those folks. Otherwise, that's kind of the majority of the conversations that I have.
Well, and moving forward, do you think, in your opinion, do you think that most podcasts should have YouTube? Should it be more of like a simulcast? Should it be a package, depending on how the listener or the audience wants to take in the content? Or do you think that there are real use cases for keeping podcast and YouTube content, even if it's a similar creator?
It's so hard to say. I would
I know. I was hoping you would have the answer
with, the numbers in front of me and how much it costs to actually invest in a studio setup or whatever, money you're going to have to spend to actually make this thing run. But as an outside observer, I do see that the content that really plays on YouTube feels very different than maybe the podcast content that we would all get excited about, maybe. And so I think that's something that people need to really consider. Like, they are different products at the end of the day.
They are, but what I'm seeing is that you can take a show that originated as an piece of audio content, and if you feed it onto YouTube, we don't know how many people are actually staring at the screen, particularly if it's like Talking Heads. But what I do know is that the impression, or what we count as a view versus what we count as a download, whether or not that's actually an impression, it does seem like the one that comes through the video may very well have more impact than the one that just comes audio only. Now, that could be because you're, in theory, stationary when you are consuming the video one. So even if you're not watching, you can very easily open your screen, click the link that's embedded in the show description for the ad you just heard, and convert over. So you don't have to wait as long to track that behavior associated with the impression. But whether or not that's a kind of a shell game because of when the ad is consumed, there's definitely value there. And so I think that we're seeing a lot of networks that are being very successful in diversifying their distribution points to be audio and video. It's cheap to do. It's virtually free to do. and they'll get enough incremental volume that it'll be worth doing it. So my view is the conversation may be the primary thing, and it should stand alone as an audio asset. But if you're in the creation business, you should have it on YouTube as well and get that extra traction. You'll definitely be able to monetize it, even if you sell it separately or bundle it together. I'm seeing that commercially that's working quite well.
Well, and speaking of commercially and expanding beyond just the audio form of podcast, we've seen recently a trend towards live events in podcast, and even what we saw with Only Murders in the Building, where they staged an entire interactive and engaging exhibition in New York. I would be curious to hear your take on that. Like, obviously, some of these events are successful. Right now, it seems that most of the tickets are free, and they're just more like audience creation, interaction, and awareness. But it seems people are being more creative about how they expand their product than they have been before. Are you noticing this as well?
Yeah, I think I'm particularly intrigued by products that podcasters sell and how they this is similar. Like I'm very interested in how people make money in different ways. So as an example, I wrote this piece about podcasters who have their guests pay to appear on their show. And that was a way that they're able to make money and I guess get their guests to invest their time and money to be on the show. And so that is like one example of just creatively thinking about how you can monetize your show. So yeah, I mean, events I think are pretty established as something that like, yeah, if you have the audience that's willing to pay, absolutely go for it. And I think there's going to be new ways to try to find revenue opportunities.
I think you're going to see experimentation there for the next few years. I think this is a good opportunity to look back at our friends in radio and what has been going on for generations. Don't forget about the inflatable gorilla in front of the car dealership and the DJ that's playing something outside. If it gives customers an extra reason to show up and affiliate with the brand, they're going to do it. It might look a little cooler and a little classier, but I also think that podcasts, because it's been like such a prestige thing, it's been so cool, like that we don't reduce ourselves to stuff like that. It's got to be a high-end classy event. Like, I think a lot of the expensive experimentation you're going to see going away. And I'm sure people will be trying to grapple with it for a while, but it's called NTR. It's a line item in the radio business, non-traditional revenue. And basically the way that was, when I was a salesperson in that business, what that was defined as NTR is anything that isn't bolted down, sell it. And there is no change in where this is going. If it is not bolted down and they can sell it, they will sell it within the confines of the law, and it's not very heavily regulated.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, I guess also podcast is such a storytelling and more of an intimate medium that it lends itself to things like this. Yeah, in theory, it lends itself to things like this more easily. I know, Ashley, you mentioned your interest in what the play out is when podcast expands globally a little bit more. Our agency has actually started to do a lot of work in that space. I know, Neal, you have been firsthand in this. Do you want to dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear your perspective. We have a few global clients, and they're seeing the success of podcasts, obviously, in the U.S., and they're seeing, there's an opportunity to look at kind of using that platform in other markets. I mean, if it works in the US, hopefully it works in other geographies like the UK, Australia, Mexico, Brazil, etc. So I'm curious from your perspective, and I think, kind of the view maybe on the other side of the podcast creators and the Spotify's of the world, is that like the next stage of real explosive growth? Is it going to come from global, where maybe the US is growing still growing, but at a slower clip, but there's a lot more faster growth happening outside of the US?
Yeah, I mean, I would be very surprised if there's someone in the US who doesn't know what a podcast is at this point, but perhaps there's places around the world that maybe aren't as familiar, or it hasn't reached that point of saturation yet where they're everyone is aware and everyone has either decided they're a podcast person or not. And so I do think that there's opportunity there. I will say, like, gosh, like 5 years ago, I used to host a podcast, but I didn't cover podcasts at the time. And I remember I was talking to our marketing team and I was like, how are you going to market my show? Like, I really wanted to do well. And he was like, you know, people don't know what a podcast is. He's like, we have to tell them to literally press the purple app in their phone to be able to find you. And it's pretty amazing how far we've come since then in the US. And I think that could still be the case abroad. Like, hey, press the purple app or the green app icon or whatever it is in whatever country. And so I just can imagine that, yes, and we've reached that point in the US where everyone gets it now. I think maybe abroad, there's still some room to explain.
Yeah, I think I read recently that if you're a Spanish-speaking country or an English-speaking country, that there's plenty of content available to you. But the majority, like still the majority of content is either in English or in Spanish. So it's to me, it seems like there has to be more content in more languages that are going to appeal to local, to the local countries. And so that's, in order for it to grow, it's kind of expanding beyond kind of the language restrictions that may occur today.
Earlier, you mentioned you're always up for juicy gossip. So let's dive in. We have two pieces of juicy gossip. One we have to tell you off air and off record, but the second I would love to get into right now. And it's about how Brene Brown was so outspoken about Joe Rogan and Spotify and chose to pause her show for a while. And then just last week, or within the last couple of weeks, we find out her relationship with Spotify is now ended. We'll never know necessarily, or we personally don't know the reason behind it. But if you look at it from a higher level, it really comes down to brand values and what it means to stand behind voices that align with you or not. As we look ahead at 2023 and the potential recession or recession, however we're talking about it now, but this relationship between brand responsibility and stakeholder capitalism and sort of influencer personalities and voices that are really taking hold in podcast, it hit a real fever pitch in 2022. And do we think that will continue to grow in 2023? Or do you think that the realities of the economic sort of downturn will affect how much that matters and how listeners react to that?
Like how listeners react to brands that align with themselves with certain hosts or whoever that maybe they don't agree with politically or something else.
Yeah. Do we think that brands will focus more on performance when it comes to ad dollars? Or do you think that brand values and hosts will really still have as strong of a hold as it did before?
I mean, when the Rogan saga happened, like the thing that stood out to me is, okay, like with YouTube and adpocalypses, to my understanding, the people who advertise on Rogan, he's been a podcaster for so many years and they've been loyal advertisers on his show. They know what he's about. They get presumably some great performance returns from it. And it's not a surprise. And there wasn't an adpocalypse when all the Rogan stuff happened. It was very much like, hey, these advertisers know what they're advertising against. So I don't know. I mean, I think that if performance is important, unless there is some serious, egregious pushback against, someone saying something super egregious, maybe then brands will change their tune. But I mean, I would be surprised.
So I'll give my perspective, being in some version of this for a couple decades now. We saw our peak level of brand sensitivity 20 to 22. That was unprecedented and probably not sustainable, where brands were willing to cut back on ROI for the sake of knowing they were going to cut back on ROI for the sake of making sure that they were values aligned with their content. The problem was there really weren't tools to help them do anything but make very arbitrary decisions. We've been very personally involved in helping with the development and promotion of those tools, which are now in existence. And I think the desire is still going to be there. But if I just used as a proxy how many calls per month I get about a host controversy today versus 2 years ago, it is significantly lower today. People are concerned about today's news. they are starting to prioritize savings over what is your carbon footprint. That is shifting for a lot of consumers, and it's going to shift for a lot of marketers. But that doesn't mean they don't care, and it doesn't mean they don't want to try. I think the value is not going away. I think the hope and expectations are not going to go away. And maybe the tools and the solutions aren't as shiny as they are when Joe Rogan is the dominant news story in the country. We got different dominant news stories right now, but the brands don't want to just be hypocrites on this stuff. They don't want to turn their backs on every value they've been proposing for the last few years and the commitments that they've made. And so I think they're going to want to, but where the rubber meets the road is that there's going to be a little bit of a correction in it as they have to make decisions that are financially motivated first. And I'm just going to end with a quote that my team has heard from me and we'll keep hearing again. I'm going to repeat it often. Howard Schultz says that the price of admission for being a values-driven company is financial performance. And I believe that very truly. Values don't go away, but the company goes away if you don't start with financial performance. And so you're going to see a little bit more compromise. And I think the tools are going to be helpful in helping brands not throw the baby out with the bathwater and not make arbitrary cuts of genres just because they're concerned about value adjacency. I think the tools are actually going to help.
Well, so what we decided, podcast is just a medium thing for now, and that might be fine. We need to get younger audiences in, and a chatbot similar to chatbot GBT might be the way to do it. So I think 1 hour very well spent. Thank you so much, Ashley. We loved having you on the show.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for reading. I have a newsletter. It's called Soundbite. It comes out weekly. It's about the audio industry. I don't have like a very handy link. I don't have a promo code. I got to get one of those. So find me on Twitter at Ashley R. Carman.
Perfect.
Do you have time for do you have time for me to do an endorsement of Ashley, by the way, while she's doing her plug?
Yeah, you have -1 minute.
I love all the people that cover the podcast beat, but when it comes to being an investigative reporter who breaks stories, Ashley is the only game in town. If somebody has to start by following one journalist in this field, it is Ashley Carman, period.
Thank you, Dan.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you so much. As always, this show is dedicated to our mission of mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We want you to not just know the news, but to use it for good. If you're a marketer looking to balance your business objectives with your brand values, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Thank you to our guests and to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, and the team at Podcast One. And as always, influence responsibly.